Hi. So today we are sitting here with Ajamu Baraka. Before I introduce Ajamu, my name is Janvieve Comrie. I'm the founder and executive director of AfroResistance. And as the name says it, it's an organization that resists and centers blackness. And our we are a 22-year-old organization, and we work around transnational issues that center liberation, human rights, dignity, and we oppose all forms of oppression. And Ajamu, if you could just present yourself very briefly before we get into this conversation today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Janvieve. My name is Ajamu Baraka. I am the director of the Black Alliance for Peace North-South Project for People-Centered Human Rights.
Perfect. So, why we organize this very impromptu call, but really important one, is because as the United States commemorates 200 years of nationhood, we continue to hear political leaders, talk about democracy, freedom, and the Constitution as well. And we hear them speak about these things as though these ideals have simply been imperfectly applied, which has led us to where we are today. Yet, we understand that from the genocide of indigenous peoples to racial slavery to military interventions to economic sanctions and the support of authoritarian regimes abroad, many scholars argue that these are not deviations from the American, and I use that term loosely, the American project, but the structural features of it. So a question for you, Ajamu, is at what point does continuing to describe the United States as a democracy actually become an obstacle to political clarity?
Well, again, thank you so much for having me. And I think that your question is the question itself lays out the contradictions. That is the particular kind of relationship that we have as African people vis-a-vis the U.S. state and the history of this project. We refer to the United States of America as I think correctly as a settler colonial project. That's in fact what it was. It was quite clear that that was their intentions when they began to expand westward. Once they were able to remove themselves from the constraints that were imposed on them by their British masters, and that was really the intent of the so-called Revolutionary War. Once they fought the British, this upstart element of the so-called founding fathers, these slavers, who had two things in mind. One was that they coveted the lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains, and they wanted to secure those lands and import African labor in order to make themselves rich. That was their motivation. That was the basis of the conflict they had with England, and that became the basis of their glorious claim for independence. But part of that independence contradiction was that while they freed themselves up to expand slavery and to begin the process of conquering the entire territory that became the United States of America, those of us who were in the U.S., who had been transported from Africa to that continent, who were still enslaved and whose condition did not change after the so-called Revolutionary War, then for us, we have a different history and a different perspective. I think it's important that we recognize and we remind people that a large number of African people in the U.S., or what became the U.S., in this glorious revolutionary conflict between the British and the what became the U.S. New ruling class, uh, Africans fought on the side of the British, even though the British were also enslavers. And that offer of freedom was something that many people held with suspicion. The one thing that they did understand was if they remained with the U.S. forces, with the patriots, if you will, that slavery was in fact a their likely a continued existence and experience. And so they took a chance and they sided with the British and they fought against the American Revolution, if you will. And so that relationship has to be front and center when we think about this 250th anniversary. That basically our experience in this country is much different than the mythology that most of the settlers have been able to embrace. It's been a history of struggle, a history of attempting to try to physically survive, a history of constant demands and struggle for our basic human rights. And so while the settlers can pretend that they have this glorious so-called democracy that is the envy of the world, our lived experience is contrary to that. And we have a perspective, we have an experience as important and probably more important than the mythology of the U.S. To express, and that in fact is what we much must express during this so-called celebration period.
Mm.
The fact that not only have we survived, but we are still engaged in struggle. There still are attempts to try to undermine and destroy us as a people and we are still in resistance, fighting for the integrity of our lives and the dignity of our people.
Thank you. So I have a quick follow up, right? Just because I know a lot of the folks that listen to both our work through Afro Resistance and through the Black Alliance for Peace um, are movement based folks, right? So from what you explained, the institutions themselves, right, 250 years ago and moving forward, were built to preserve um, capitalism, to preserve colonial power, right? How should movements be talking about the United States today?
They should be talking about the U.S. in honest terms. That this, in fact, is a colonial capitalist project. That it is responsible for tremendous suffering for not only African people, but for the indigenous people of this land. That even the promises that were given to white workers who immigrated to this country were promises that in many cases were not kept at all because they were unable to be kept because of the very nature of this system. A society that even today many people still immigrate to because they are impacted by the policies of the U.S. that now has become an empire uh, as a consequence of the basis of the riches that it derived from the enslavement of African people and the conquering of indigenous land. And as a consequence of those policies, in far off lands, they have made it so difficult to live in those nations that people have felt compelled to attempt to escape those conditions. And as always, like it was during the period of the Roman Empire, the people in the periphery of the empire are the ones that then begin to move toward the center of the empire. And that's the migration pattern that we see today with people whose lives have been disrupted, economies destroyed by U.S. exploitation, then pack up and move toward the U.S. And when they come to the U.S., they're faced with conditions that aren't that much different than what they were facing back in their homeland. In fact, they discover that it's even more difficult sometimes to be poor in the U.S. Than it is in the so-called periphery. Because in the U.S., there's absolutely no recognition of the value of their lives and that they are, in fact, bearers of fundamental human rights. And so that is the welcoming that they get. They face detention. They face assaults by ICE, and they join with the already suffering and exploited African people and indigenous people to be part of this experience of national oppression, of colonized experience, of super exploitation, of denied rights. And that is the reality that we face from the bottom up. And those are the kinds of realities we have to talk about. We cannot and we will not participate in a process of whitewashing history, of celebrating something that has been denied to millions of people, not only in this country, but millions of people globally who have been negatively impacted by the imperialist policies of the US. We say, you want to celebrate the US? Ask a Palestinian living in Gaza in a tent what they think about the U.S. and U.S. policies and U.S. promises of freedom and human rights. And I think that helps to put all of these things in their proper perspective.
Thank you very much for that. Now, there is a growing understanding and consensus, right, that we are living through a period of declining U.S. global hegemony. We're seeing the emergence of multipolarity, expanding South to South cooperation, and there are more and more states within the United States willing to challenge the U.S. U.S. dominance, Washington's dominance, right? Now, at the same time, and AfroResistance is 22 years old, right? And you've been working on this for many decades. Also, what we are seeing is that in many progressive anti-war movements, there seems to be more fragmentations now than there were decades ago. And militarism continues expanding throughout the region. How would you explain this contradiction?
What we are witnessing, what we are experiencing is the latter stages of an empire that is now exhausted, that the ability for it to expand and to exploit has now have had limitations imposed on it as a consequence of the competition coming from nations like China and the move away from the unchallengeable power of the U.S. That it has experienced for the last few decades are now being challenged by various powers, the creation of what people refer to as multipolarity, where you don't have one center any longer dominating global politics and dominating the international economy. And as a consequence, the U.S. has found it very difficult to figure out how it's going to exist, how it's going to live on this planet with other nations that it can no longer dominate,
Mm-hmm.
other nations that, in fact, they are relatively dependent on for things like rare earth minerals and other kinds of resources that are absolutely required for the U.S. economy to continue. And so, because they're unable to deal with their lack of their ability to impose themselves on the rest of humanity, they are now engaging in fantasies,
Mm-hmm.
dangerous fantasies that they can maintain their global hegemony through the use of military force. And therefore, they have been imposing sanctions on nations across the planet. More than 40 nations have been subjected to U.S. Economic warfare. They have imposed themselves in attacking other nations with kinetic warfare. Iran being the latest example of that. They are attempting to reconsolidate their power in the Americas by recolonizing the nations in the Caribbean and in South America as part of their attempt to try to shore up their power in order for them to more effectively compete on the global level. The consequence of that, of course, has been horrendous with the siege of Cuba, with the right wing reemerging in nations across the Americas continent, and millions of people are suffering the inability to express themselves democratically, are being subjected to all kinds of violence from these comprador states in alignment with the U.S., all because the U.S. is unable to accept its decline. It doesn't mean that the U.S. is going to be subordinate. It is just unable to impose itself.
Correct.
And because of the white supremacist colonial mentality, it cannot accept that. And therefore, it is engaged in reckless behavior that is now resulted in most of the population on this planet concluding that the greatest threat to international humanity stems, emanates from the United States of America. So, that's how we should understand it. That basically, this is the end of an era. The 500 year and plus reign of the Pan-European project that started in 1492 has come to an end. And that is why we see this decline. That's why we see these desperate policies by the U.S. In alignment with their allies in Europe. That's why we see an attempt to renormalize white supremacy, to try to galvanize the entire white population in order for it to perceive that its survival requires it uniting against everybody else. And that's why we see what we refer to as the attempt to normalize global fascism.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the conditions that we are faced today. These are the conditions that inform the celebration of 250 years of U.S. settler colonialism and a few decades of the U.S. empire. And these are the conditions that we have to understand, we have to fight against if we're ever going to be in a position to build a society, a global society that centers people-centered human rights, that really is able to express and exercise democracy, and for the people to share in the abundance of this planet, but in a way in which everybody can share equally and we all can prosper. But that's going to take struggle. It's going to take a fight because these forces are committed to attempting to maintain their dominance, and that's why they have, in fact, declared war on the rest of us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And now that you go into war and declared war on to the rest of us, much of the work that we do at AfroResistance centers Black migration and centers human rights and really transnational solidarity. And what we're seeing now more and more across Latin America and the Caribbean, and we can use many countries as examples, right? Um, is U.S. military intervention and presence, economic policies that impact local communities and impact poor people, Black people first, and support for these authoritarian governments, like in El Salvador, for example, that have contributed and continue contributing to displacement and instability, specifically of Black communities. Yet, when people migrate north seeking safety and opportunity, they're met with detention, with deportations, with family separations, with criminalization, and with xenophobic policies and politics, right? How should we understand the relationship between the empire here, the empire abroad, and repressions at the different borders?
Well, as we have been discussing, these are the manifestations of a dying empire. These are the policies that they are attempting to try to impose on the rest of humanity. These are the conditions that have are driving people from their national environments, their nations to the U.S. Only to face repression, exploitation. Uh, these are all of the consequences of these kinds of policies and the unequalness that we experience in the United States of America. That these individuals, families, that find themselves on the receiving end of capitalist exploitation, and they try to make their way to the imperialist core country. Um, they are people who have dignity. They are people, in fact, who have human rights. And that's why we want to shout out and raise up the work of Afro-Resistance. It's always been in the forefront of helping people to understand that migrants are, in fact, human beings, that migrants have fundamental human rights, that there, in fact, is international human rights law that governs how states are supposed to relate to migrants and how states are obligated to recognize and to protect the fundamental human rights of migrants. And so, that's part of the broader human rights struggle that we have to wage. And that struggle is not just a struggle to make demands. That struggle that we have to wage in order that migrants are recognized as full human beings,
Mm-hmm.
that African workers are recognized as having value, that Palestinians are not subjected to ongoing genocide, that we don't have wars being normalized in order to continue with the exploitation of people and resources. That requires struggle. It requires us building the capacity, the power to be able to put a break on these kinds of policies. And so we don't just make demands, we build movement, we build power. That is the responsibility that Afro Resistance has taken on. That's the responsibility that we are attempting to take on through the North South Project for People Centered Human Rights, linking up the struggling people of the so called Global South with those oppressed communities and people in the North to build the kind of structural and institutional power that we need to have in order to free ourselves, to liberate ourselves, and to build a new world.
Thank you. And to add to your answer, um, I'm always, at the organizations, and I know at BAP as well, we're always navigating how and where their movements will successfully reframe migration as a human rights issue that is actually rooted in global inequality and conflict and climate disruption and historical responsibility, and not just national security, because that's what we constantly get, right? It's a national security, it's a border issue. But no, these are human rights issues rooted in history of oppression that go against the needs and the necessities of people and lead to all these things. So I'm glad that you mentioned around migration, which is sometimes seen as like something else, something separate, something from abroad, and only as they enter the United States borders. And then, just to start closing it up, Ajamu, um, the crisis that we're confronting, from militarism, racial capitalism, migration, we have to add also climate collapse, right? Understanding that they're all interconnected and that movements have to also evolve and shift, right? And language is a big part of that. What do you see as the essential strategic tasks for organizers over the next, let's say, decade, if we're really serious about confronting this empire rather than simply protesting its latest manifestations and moving on to the next campaign and the next campaign and the next issue as they also throw stuff at us, right? And at the world, really. What kind of
Yeah.
political education, movement building, international solidarity will this moment in history require?
Well, we have to maybe take a page from capital itself. Capitalism has basically not allowed borders to put any kind of limitations on its movement. Capital moves to wherever it can extract value to make profit. Those of us who are on the receiving end of this kind of activity. We have to move in a similar way. That is, in the sense that a recognition of our common humanity, but even more importantly, our common interests. That we, in fact, have an interest that's opposite to the interest of international capital. That um, the ideal and the value, the principle of internationalism has to guide how we move, how we operate, and how we see the world. That we are going to make sure that we're not allowed, that we don't allow capital to exploit our differences. We embrace our differences by grounding those differences in a common political project. And that project is to transform ourselves and to transform our realities, to name the enemy. And we have no issue with that in the Black Alliance of Peace. We say that the main enemy that faces global humanity is the pan European white supremacist colonial capitalist project grounded in patriarchy. And so we name the enemy, therefore, so we can know what we have to fight against. But we also must begin to articulate a vision in which we are able to live in society side by side with the recognition of our common value, with a commitment to building societies in which the kinds of scarcity that people are experiencing, not having access to health care or decent housing or a clean environment or adequate food, that commitment to a politics grounded in ethical principles that says that all of us are equal, all of us have fundamental human rights, and therefore a society to be legitimate, it has to be organized in a way in which everyone's dignity is protected, everyone's fundamental human right to live and live with social security is recognized. And so, again, for that to happen, we have to fight. We have to understand that we can't just pontificate, or we can't just write papers or organize webinars. We have to build power, uniting with people who have a similar kind of outcome, a similar kind of outlook, that is, and build power with those elements and try to win as many people as we can over to our side. People who believe in the possibility that we, the majority, can in fact transform our conditions. So that's the task, and that's the responsibility we face at this particular moment in history. And we have to be successful, because if we aren't, then we're going to be subjected to a prolonged period of fascism.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, Jamo, for grounding us in political clarity, especially because this moment demands political clarity. What I'm taking away from this conversation is that empire does not move in isolation, it moves globally. It also extracts globally, it militarizes globally, and it produces displacement globally. And that means that our resistance cannot remain trapped inside of the borders of the United States, inside single issue politics, or inside these illusions that these crises are one here, one there, they're all connected, right? I'm also taking away that for those of us on the receiving end of colonialism, racism, war, sanctions, state violence, etc., internationalism is not abstract. It's not an abstract idea. It's not a goal, right? It is a survival strategy. It's a necessity that we have. It is a way of understanding that our communities, and I live in the Bronx. We work on issues regarding Haiti, right? We work from Palestine to Panama, Colombia, the African continent. And, everybody is facing different expressions of the exact same system of domination, right? I also believe from the conversation that if international capital understands common interests, and our movements must understand ours, right? And that we have to refuse that the lies that they tell us, that they tell that they tell us, for example, that immigrants are the problem, that black people are the problem, that women are the problem, also that everybody's disposable, that war actually brings peace, and that the empire can deliver us justice, right? We have to start really dismantling that and really believing that this is not the, well, I think a lot of us believe that these are not truths, but we have to start organizing, knowing that these are not truths, um, and that our task is to build relationships, political education, courage, and solidarity, right? And when I say courage, I also speak about people that censor themselves because they don't want to offend or they don't want to do all these different things. They they worry about funding, for example, right? So we have to stop. Um, we have to have courage to speak the truth, right? So thank you again, Ajamu, for your clarity, for your wisdom, um, for your commitment to anti-war, right, and for the human rights struggle. Many don't know that we've been in a work relationship, mentorship, friendship, family, for over 20 years, and that is, it has been an honor for me to keep on growing and learning with you. So every conversation that I have with you, I leave not only more informed, but more committed, right, to organizing, especially across borders. So thank you very much, and we'll see each other
Thank
soon.
you for inviting me, and I will return the commentary that I've always been inspired by your commitment, your dynamism, and it's always been, I think, the kind of model that we want our people to be exposed to, the kind of fight that we have to engage in, the kind of principal opposition that we have to build in order for us to realize all of our objectives. Our main objective, of course, is building a society, building a world in which we all are valued, and that we can live in peace and prosperity. So thank you for your years of service.
All right, thank you.